two things about Susan which are relevant to this organization. The first one is that amongst other people who were at the first seminar, which was 2006, was Michael Rutter, who was, I gather, the supervisor to her PhD. And another person who was part of that first meeting was Martin Richards, who founded the organization that she now runs in Cambridge. So over to you then, Susan, because what you're going to be talking about is forms of parenting. And I think there is going to be a lot of challenge of received views in what you're going to say. So over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I think this is third time lucky because we've had Brexit and elections and various other interferences. So it's very nice to be here online, even though it is from my kitchen. Thank you very much. Sorry about that slight hiccup. So, yes, so what I'm going to talk about today is research that goes back to the mid-1970s on children in new family forms. And as I'll explain in a minute, this is research that did begin with Michael Rutter. So what I'd like to do is give an overview from the very early studies, which were on lesbian mother families, moving forward to talk about research on children born through assisted reproduction, then through surrogacy, more recently gay father families, and very recently children with transgender parents. So I'm going to take this kind of historical arc, starting at where the research began, which actually was in 1976. And I got involved in this area of research by complete accident, really. I just happened to pick up a copy of some of you may remember, the feminist magazine Spare Rib. This picture was on the cover and it said, why could one of these women lose custody of her child? And I opened it up and read about the fact that lesbian women, when they divorced, always, without exception, lost custody of their children to their former husbands. And what happened in these custody cases was that expert witnesses would be brought in on either side. The expert who was most commonly brought in and beside of the mother was actually Sir Michael Rutter, who would argue that what really mattered for children was the quality of parent-child relationships. And an expert brought in on behalf of the father was often somebody of a more psychoanalytic persuasion who would argue that the children would grow up to have psychological problems, they would be unsure of their gender identity, and so on. And in the absence of any empirical research, then judges would give custody to fathers who had often remarried by then or had a new female partner over mothers. So that was the beginning. And there were really three main issues that always came up in these custody cases. Firstly, it was argued that lesbian mothers were less nurturing than heterosexual mothers. Secondly, that children were more likely to experience psychological problems, or would be, and also that boys would be less masculine and girls less feminine than boys and girls who grew up in heterosexual homes. So thanks to a small grant that Mike Rutter procured from the Nuffield Foundation, we carried out the very first study. It was actually carried out at the same time as two other American studies. So these were the first studies in the world. And we found that contrary to the concerns that had been raised in court, that lesbian mothers were just as warm, involved, and committed to their children as heterosexual mothers. The children were no more likely to show emotional or behavioral problems, and neither did they differ in terms of their gender identity. So this was a study, and also the American as well, of children aged around 10, 11 years old. Shortly after we published, a couple of years after we published that study, Margaret Thatcher's famous, infamous Section 28 came into force, where schools were not allowed to teach about same-sex relationships, which were referred to in the Act as pretended family relationships. So partly for this reason, and partly because the research had been criticised for only studying children, I decided to follow up the children in the original study to see what happened when they were adults. And what we found was that, in fact, their psychological well-being wasn't impaired. They were doing just as well, just as likely to have problems or not have problems as anybody else. And the question that had always come up in child custody cases was, would the children grow up to be lesbian or gay or bisexual themselves, which was seen as a reason in these days to deny their mother's custody. And in fact, what we found was that almost all of them identified as heterosexual as young adults. Now, although these custody cases had been happening below the radar, the general public first became aware of lesbian mother families in 1978, when a London evening newspaper exposed a Harley Street doctor for offering donor insemination to lesbian women. And this caused a huge furore at the time, and questions were asked in the House of Commons and also in the House of Lords, and there were calls to ban lesbian women from having children. Now, lesbian women in the 1970s were generally not having children through donor insemination, but through the 80s and 90s, then that began to change. And so these were planned lesbian mother families rather than lesbian mother families resulting from divorce, where couples had children together through one of them having donor insemination. And as you were saying earlier, and is very important to your organization, the early years are very important in children's later development. So one question about the earlier studies of children in lesbian mother families is that these children had all spent their early years in a traditional family with a mother and a father. So the question was then, would that be, would the outcomes be any different if they were born into a lesbian mother family, raised in a lesbian mother family with no father right from birth? So a number of studies of this issue were carried out in the US and in Europe and in the UK. And in fact, we found the results were exactly the same. So again, no differences for children raised in lesbian mother families from birth. And a third criticism samples, but in the 1990s it became possible to collaborate with large epidemiological studies, which we did in the UK of 7-year-olds with the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, and a US colleague, Charlotte Patterson, and her team worked with 14-year-olds with the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. And we found that even with general population studies, the findings were the same. Now, 1978 was a big year for new family forms because, as well as the general public discovering that lesbian women were raising children, it was also the year that Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, was born. And that led to a number of concerns. Although in many ways her birth was welcomed as a scientific breakthrough, there were also concerns about, well, there was talk about Frankenstein babies, concerned about how parents might feel about children born in this way and whether it might affect the relationships. Particularly, concern was raised about assisted reproductive procedures involving a third party. So in these days, that would be referring to donor insemination or sperm donation, where the children lacked a genetic link with their father. So we began a study. It was a 4-country European study that involved the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and the UK. And this was the first study of IVF children and also of donor insemination children, which was the only other option for fertility treatment in these days. And this was a longitudinal study. We followed the children up at 6, at 12, and again at age 18. And contrary to the concerns that had been raised about these children, in fact, we found that where there were differences between these families and either our comparison groups of adoptive or natural conception families, the assisted reproduction families were doing better in terms of our indices of parenting quality. And the children themselves were doing well, showing high levels of psychological well-being. But one really striking finding was that not one set of the 111 parents of children born through sperm donation had told their children by the time they were 6, told them about their genetic origins. And by age 12, it was still the case that less than 10% had disclosed to children their origins. And we were very, in some ways, surprised, but also interested in parents' reasons for this, because by then, all of the research on adoption was telling us that it was better for parents to be open with their children about their birth family, and it seemed that the same might apply to these children as well. And the parents' main reason, they told us, was fear. So they were frightened that were they to tell their children that their father was not their genetic father, then they might not love their father so much, and it might interfere with relationships within the family as a whole. So that was the main reason that parents were not telling their children. Some felt they wished they had, but by age 6, they'd left it too late. So as we were really interested in the outcomes of children knowing that they were conceived by donor conception, we began another study 15 years later at the millennium. And here we just, because the IVF children seemed to be doing very well, and the concerns were really about children who had been donor conceived, we just focused on sperm donation children and children born through egg donation, and a comparison group of natural conception families. This study is still ongoing, so we have seen the families when the children were 1, 2, 3, 7, 10, and 14, and we're currently seeing them at age 20 as young adults. What we found was that our findings replicated the earlier European study. So where there were differences, the assisted reproduction families were doing even better than the others. And that was true even when the child lacked a non-genetic link to a parent. And again, the children were very well-functioning children. At age 7, so that's an interesting age, because by age 7, adopted children have developed a more sophisticated understanding of what it means to be adopted and of the sense of loss involved in adoption, and not just the story about gaining an adoptive family. And also by that age, children really understand more about inheritance as well. So that's why we were particularly interested to see the families at that age. And what we found is we began to see differences between the families that had been open with their children about the children's conception and those who had kept it secret. And although they were all generally well-functioning families, we did see some differences, and the ones who had disclosed generally showed more positive outcomes. And interestingly, the parents who had been open with their children, they felt that in fact, their fears had been unfounded, because the children were either completely uninterested or curious about their origins. By age 14, we had very clear effects between age at disclosure and outcomes in terms of mother-child relationships. And those who'd been told when they were young, and by that I mean at age 4 or younger, had better relationships with their mothers at age 14. And interestingly, this effect was seen with independent data from the mothers and also from the adolescents themselves. Now, in this country, there was a change to the regulations of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, so that children from 2005 now have the right to find out who the donor is when they reach age 18. And the first of these children will reach that age and be able to ask for identifying information about their donor in 2023. So to begin to understand what it is that children might want to know, we worked with the Donor Sibling Registry in the United States, and we carried out a survey of donor-conceived children who were aware that they were donor-conceived. And what they most wanted to know about their donor was, do I look like him? Is my personality like his? And also a bit about his family background. But interestingly, we found that although the children and young adults were interested in finding out about their donor, they didn't see him as their father, and they were really much more interested in their donor siblings, so other children who had grown up in different families but born from the same donor. We also found, as we had in our UK study, that age at which children discovered they were donor conceived made a difference. So just to give you a couple of examples that reflect the overall findings. So Anna, who was 13 at the time and found out at age 4, said, "I've always been accepting of it because I never knew any different." Whereas Mandy, who was 19 and didn't find out till she was 12, said, "It was one of the most shocking and upsetting experiences of my life. I felt alone." In 2013, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics published a report of all the evidence and concluded that for children born through donor conception, through egg, sperm, or embryo donation, then the earlier that parents tell them about their conception, the better. But they didn't want to make it mandatory that parents should have to tell their children. Now, probably one of the most controversial forms of assisted reproduction is surrogacy. Some of you may remember the infamous Kim Cotton case in 1985, where Kim Cotton was the first surrogate, commercial surrogate in the United Kingdom, and it caused a great scandal at the time. The Warnock report had already come out against surrogacy, saying it's inconsistent with human dignity that a woman should use her uterus for financial profit and treat it as an incubator for someone else's child. Now, after Kim Cotton had her baby, the Surrogacy Arrangements Act was rushed through Parliament and banned commercial surrogacy in this country. And the idea was that surrogacy would just wither away because nobody would want to do it if they didn't get paid. But in fact, the opposite happened. And there was an increase in surrogacy in the UK, which led the government to commission another review, which the Brazier report was a 3-person committee, in which I was one of the 3, and our report came out in 1998. As part of this, I became very aware that just as you know, the situation had been with lesbian mother families, that where decisions were being made about whether or not this kind of assisted reproduction should happen, based on ideas about what might happen for the children, without any actual empirical data. So again, it was all very much based on assumption about potentially negative outcomes for children. So we began another study. Well, in fact, we just brought in a group of surrogacy families, 42 surrogacy families, who we followed up alongside our other assisted reproduction families from age 1 and again up to age 20. And we were interested in whether or not the children were psychologically harmed, but by knowing that they had been conceived with the deliberate intention of the surrogate handing them over to the intended parents. How would children feel about this, especially if large amounts of money had changed hands? And other questions that were of interest: who do they see as their real mother? Is it the surrogate, or is it the mother who brings them up? What happens if the surrogate is also their genetic mother, as sometimes happens? And also, if the surrogate remains in contact with the family, does that undermine the intended mother's relationship with the child? What we found is a bit like the other kinds of assisted reproduction families, that in fact, surrogacy families were functioning very well. The children themselves were functioning well. We did find an increase in adjustment problems around age 7, which had disappeared by age 10. And that was interesting because it's similar to the pattern you see in studies of internationally adopted children. And that is thought to be it's been attributed to children having to deal with issues of identity at an earlier age than most other children. We found that by age 14, the surrogacy children were doing really well in terms of measures of self-esteem, mental health, and positive psychological well-being. Another surprising finding was because it was assumed that, or thought that the parents, once they had their child, they might discard the surrogate and have no interest in the surrogate anymore. And in fact, that wasn't the case. And by the 10 years on after the birth, 60% of the parents were in touch with the surrogate. At age 14, we were able to ask the children themselves, because a lot of people thought, children are bound to be upset by being born in this way. And we found the opposite. Of the 42, we had 42 surrogacy families in the study, and one child had some concerns about it, wasn't entirely happy. All of the others were either just felt not very interested or neutral, or some of them saw it as a positive thing. So just to give you a couple of examples, Simon, who was 14, said, "I was talking to somebody at school and they said they were an accident. I know I was really wanted and it makes me feel special." And Chris, age 14, said, "I think it's cool. I quite like talking about it because it's an interesting fact about me." So where are we today? Well, the Law Commission is currently doing a review on surrogacy. They had a public consultation in 2019, and they expect that they will publish a report and have a draft bill to go before Parliament early in 2022. Another type of family that became permitted really after the millennium were gay father families. And this happened because a change to the Adoption Act came into force in 2005, enabled same-sex couples to adopt children jointly. And here the concerns were less about lesbian mothers, but more about gay fathers, because it's often assumed that fathers are less suited to parenting than mothers, and also that gay father families may be exposed to greater stigmatization. So we worked with local authorities up and down the country, and we carried out a study of adoptive gay father families, adoptive lesbian mother, and adoptive heterosexual parent families. And when the children were 6, again, contrary to what we had predicted and what people generally expected, the gay father families were actually doing better than the other parents. This seemed to be for 2 reasons. Firstly, I think because there was a lot of hesitation about placing vulnerable children with gay men, that the fathers went through a particularly stringent screening process. But also, interestingly, these fathers were men who had always wanted to have children, thought it would never be a possibility for them. Whereas for the mothers in the other families, all of the heterosexual mothers had gone through years of fertility and fertility treatment, turned to adoption after that failed. And even that was even true of half of the lesbian mothers. So there was a difference in terms of mental health problems in the fathers, which could be a gender difference anyway, but I think exacerbated by the fertility issues faced by the mothers in the other families. Now, when we went back at age 12, there were no differences between groups in terms of quality of parenting or children's adjustment, but we did see huge problems in children across all family types. So by that time, the rates had doubled from age 6. 50% of children had either a learning difficulty, a psychological disorder, or a behavioral problem at clinical levels. And this wasn't surprising because these were all children adopted from care. Many of them had spent, you know, a very, very traumatic early years, had experiences of abuse, neglect, you know, parental drug misuse and alcoholism, and all of these risk factors. So, in fact, we found that the adoptive parents, and particularly the gay fathers, were coping really well with extremely challenging children. And I think it's just really important to point this out because so many people were against gay couples adopting children. And when we look at the fathers in our study and what they were actually doing for these children, you know, it gave a very different picture. So I'd just like to briefly tell you about one family where they had adopted 3 children who were not related to each other. The oldest was 15. Her birth mother was 13 years old when she had Kerry and in foster care. Robert, who was 11, he was his birth mother's 14th child, and his birth father had been in prison for serious crimes and was a risk to children. And Robert was born with fetal alcohol syndrome and was performing at the level of a 7-year-old. And Jamie, who was 4, his birth mother also grew up in the care system. She became pregnant with her, well, at 18, but her boyfriend was only 14 at the time. He was born with cerebral palsy and had impaired speech and mobility problems, as well as behavioral difficulties. I just want to read you a couple of quotes from when we interviewed the dad. So he said, "It has enriched our lives. We've done amazing things. We've been on wonderful holidays. And even the little one who has cerebral palsy loves football. And he's in a special football team for children with cerebral palsy. The paces are small and tiny, but I think they're more special because they're huge steps to these kids." And he also said, "I'm delighted when they come in. They'll say, 'Hi, give you a kiss and what's for dinner?' You polish their shoes and they'll sort out the homework and you help them where you can. And you thank your lucky stars every morning that you've got these kids. And then you think, imagine if they were still in care." Now the last, I realize that we're running out of time. I just want to very quickly, could I have another few minutes to say something?
Go on.
Yes,
Yep.
thank you. Transgender parent families. So again, this is a family type that's little understood. And so we carried out a study of 35 families where children had experienced their gender transition, their parents' gender transition. And for most of them, when this happened when they were young, they were very accepting of their family. So Susanna, age 14, said, "I don't remember when it actually happened. It's basically been for as long as I remember. Chloe's always been Chloe." And Vicky, age 12, said, "He's been wearing skirts for as long as I can remember. To me, it's not strange. To somebody else, maybe having a dad who wears skirts and wears pink would be weird, but to me, it's perfectly normal." But for some children, it was very difficult experiencing their parents' transition. Jade, talking about when she was 6, said, "When she transitioned, I felt there was a hole in my heart because I missed my dad." But at age 9, thinking back, she said she felt more positively about it. When she transitioned, it made her a lot happier because when she was a boy, she was really unhappy. Ever since she's transitioned, she's come home from work, hugged us, and been really happy. It's changed a lot since she transitioned. I'm just going to skip a couple of slides just to, because I know we're running out of time. So children in all these different family forms, contrary to predictions, actually seem to be doing well. But where they have problems, these problems come not from within their family, but from outside. And that is still an issue today. So children in particular with LGBT parents are exposed to a great deal of stigmatization still. So just, everyday examples, the use of the word gay that you often hear children using as a pejorative term, that's of course upsetting to children with lesbian or gay parents. And we worked with Stonewall to do a study of children's school experiences. And for some of the children, their schools were very accepting and things were fine, but for others, it was still problematic. So this child said, I can still remember when I was younger, we had to draw a medal that said #1 dad. I said I didn't want to do it. And the teacher said, just do one, don't moan. And I found that really hard. And this other child said, I wish I could talk openly about it to people. I'm too scared of what would happen, of what they would say, what if they told someone? Although it might not seem a big thing to anyone else, it does to me. And that just again, children with transgender parents, again, they have problems from the outside world, having people saying unpleasant things to them, taunting them in the street. The Stonewall study came up with a set of recommendations of what schools could do better for children. And these are just 4 of the recommendations. And this is available on the Stonewall website if anybody's interested. But one of the things, interestingly, what Andrea was saying earlier about parents always having to tell their story to all the different authorities. Children with LGBT parents have the same thing. They say, we get fed up. It's always left to us to explain over and over again. So that's one thing they think teachers should explain. They also want to see families like theirs in the books they read, the films they see, and they want teachers to respond to homophobic bullying. I won't go into this because of time, but these are some of the families that are either happening now or on the horizon in the coming years that raise different issues, and happy to talk about these in the questions if they are of interest. So putting all this research together over the years, it tells us not just about the outcomes for these different family types, but it tells us more generally about what matters for children. And it seems that family structure, so the number, the gender identity, sexual orientation, and genetic relatedness of parents matters less for children than we thought. And it matters less than the quality of family relationships. So children are most likely to flourish in warm, supportive, stable families, whatever their structure. And they're more likely to experience emotional and behavioral problems in hostile, unsupportive, and unstable families, whatever their structure. So put another way, just because people become parents in non-conventional ways doesn't make them less capable parents or love their children less. It seems, in fact, that the opposite's true. So where differences have been found between new family forms and traditional families, these differences suggest that those who've struggled against the odds to visit parents. I'm sorry, it's been a bit of a rush through some of our studies, but the book that I've just published summarizes all of the research and also talks about stories of families in all of these different family types. So thank you. I'll come out.
Thank you very much for that whirlwind presentation, really fascinating.